Millions of people see these four letters every day, INRI. They are carved into the crucifixes of churches, engraved on grandmothers' rosaries, painted in pictures hanging in hospitals, in prisons, in homes all over the world. Four letters that have been above the head of Jesus for 2,000 years, and the vast majority of people have no idea what they mean. But that is not the most surprising part. The most surprising part is that those four letters hide three secrets that the priests of the first century discovered within minutes of the crucifixion. And when they discovered them, they ran to Pilate to ask him to erase them. Three secrets, one for each language in which they were written, because that inscription was not only in Latin, it was in Hebrew, in Greek, and in Latin. Three languages, and each language was hiding something different. The first has to do with the meaning that everyone knows but nobody truly understands. The second has to do with the connection between three ancient worlds that made the cross the exact center of the universe. And the third, the one that sent the priests into a panic, has to do with four Hebrew letters that spell the most forbidden name in all the Bible. A name no Jew could pronounce. A name that only the high priest whispered once a year. And that name was written above the head of Jesus, in full view of 200,000 pilgrims, and nobody could erase it. But let's start at the beginning, with what those four letters mean, because even that is deeper than you might imagine. INRI in Latin, Iesus Nazarenus Rex Judaeorum. In English, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. That is what it says. That is what Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea, ordered to be written and nailed above the head of Jesus as he died on the cross. John 19:19 records it. Pilate also wrote a title and put it on the cross, and the writing was, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Sounds simple, right? A name and an accusation, case closed, but it isn't. Because there is a detail in the original Greek text that most translations don't capture. The word John uses to describe what Pilate wrote is titlon, title. It doesn't say accusation. It doesn't say charge. It doesn't say crime. It says title, and a title is not the same as a crime. A title is a declaration of identity, a proclamation of who you are, and that changes everything. Because Pilate did not write, accused of calling himself King of the Jews. He did not write, this man claimed to be king. He did not write, condemned for sedition. He wrote, King of the Jews, just like that, without quotation marks, without a conditional, without alleged or supposed, as a fact. As an official truth of the Roman government. That is what INRI means on the surface. But beneath the surface, there is an earthquake. Because when the priests read those words, they didn't see an accusation. They saw a coronation. Look at what John 19:21 says. So the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, do not write the King of the Jews, but rather this man said, I am King of the Jews. Do you catch the difference? The priests were not protesting the fact that Jesus was crucified. That was exactly what they wanted. What enraged them was the wording. They wanted it to say, he said he was king, not that he is king. It sounds like an insignificant nuance, but to them it was an abyss. It is the difference between a lie and a truth, between the pretension of a madman and the real identity of a person. Pilate, without meaning to, had written a declaration of royalty, not a death sentence. And when they went to ask him to change it, Pilate's response is one of the sharpest sentences in all of history. John 19:22. Pilate answered, what I have written, I have written. In Latin, quod scripsi, scripsi. Now, to understand why Pilate refused to change so much as a single letter, you need to know something that most people don't know about the relationship between this Roman governor and the Jewish leaders of Jerusalem. They did not get along, that is, putting it mildly. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, who lived in the same century, documents that Pilate had provoked the Jews multiple times since arriving in Judea. He brought standards bearing the emperor's image into Jerusalem at night, knowing the Jews considered them idols. He provoked massive riots. Then he took money from the sacred treasury of the temple to build an aqueduct and crushed the protests with violence. The relationship between Pilate and the Jewish leaders was one of accumulated resentment, constant pressure, and political blackmail. And that morning, the priests had pushed the pressure to its limit. First, they forced him to come out to the courtyard of his own palace because they didn't want to enter the house of a pagan and defile themselves before Passover, John 18:28. Then they pressured him to condemn a man in whom Pilate found no guilt at all. And when Pilate hesitated, they threatened to report him to Caesar. If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. John 19:12. That was a direct threat to his position, his career, his life. Pilate gave in. He condemned Jesus, but in that sign, he took his revenge. He wrote King of the Jews as a fact, not as an accusation. It was his way of saying to the priests, "You forced me to kill your own king. Live with that." And when they came to complain about the wording, Pilate shut the door in their faces. What I have written, I have written. That is what INRI means in the political context of the moment. A frustrated governor using a sign as a weapon against the leaders who had humiliated him. A calculated provocation. A final stab. But what Pilate could not know, what nobody on that dusty road of Golgotha could have imagined, is that those words were not only the revenge of a Roman politician. They were the deepest truth in the universe, written by the hand of a pagan who had no idea what he was proclaiming. But before showing you what was hidden, I want you to be there, not as someone reading an article. I want you to see it. Golgotha, noon. The sun falls almost vertical over Jerusalem. The heat rises from the stones as if the ground were on fire. Outside the northern wall, alongside the main road that enters the city, there is a mound of limestone rock with a strange shape. From a certain angle, the cavities in the rock look like the eye sockets of a skull. That is why they call it Golgotha, the place of the skull. In the ground, a vertical beam is driven into the earth. It is always there. The Romans don't remove it between executions. It is permanent, a sinister mast waiting for its next victim. The soldiers lift the horizontal crossbeam with a man already nailed to it. They fit it into the notch of the vertical beam. The sound of the impact echoes off the rocks. And then one of them climbs up with a piece of wood whitened with gypsum in his hand. It is the titulus tablet. He nails it above the head of the condemned man. And here you need to understand something. This was not something Rome invented for Jesus. It was standard procedure. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, who lived in the 1st century and was a direct witness to Roman crucifixions, described them as the most wretched of deaths. And the process had a brutal protocol. The condemned was stripped, flogged, and forced to walk through the busiest streets carrying the horizontal crossbeam of the cross, which weighed about 40 kilograms. During that walk, a soldier carried in front of him a whitened wooden sign with letters painted in red or black, visible from a distance. That sign was called a titulus, and on it was the name of the condemned and the crime for which he was dying. We have evidence of this practice in the writings of Suetonius, of Cassius Dio, of Eusebius. It was propaganda of terror. Rome wanted everyone who passed by to see what happened to those who challenged its authority. So what the Gospels describe is a completely normal Roman legal procedure. What was not normal was what was written on that sign. 3 lines of text. The first in Latin with larger, more official letters, IESVES, Nazarenvs, Rex, Evdorvm. The second in Greek, Isus o Nazaraios, o Vasileis ton Iudaion. The third in Aramaic, with those square letters that any Jew would recognize instantly. The crowd watches. It is Passover. Thousands of people pass along that road. John 19:20 says that many of the Jews read this title, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city. The location was no coincidence. The Romans crucified people along the main roads on purpose. They wanted everyone entering and leaving Jerusalem to see what happened to those who defied Rome. But what people read was not just a death sentence. It was something that ignited a crisis that neither Pilate nor the priests had anticipated. And here is where the three languages change everything. Because John 19:20 adds a detail that seems minor, but is a nuclear bomb. And the title was written in Hebrew, in Greek, and in Latin. Luke 23:38 confirms it. There was also an inscription over him. "This is the King of the Jews," written in letters of Greek and Latin and Hebrew. 3 languages. Why 3? Pilate could have written only in Latin, which was the official language of the empire, or only in Greek, which was the language everyone in the Mediterranean understood. Why go to the trouble of writing 3 lines in 3 different alphabets on a piece of wood to be nailed above a criminal? To understand the answer, you need to see Jerusalem at that exact moment. It is Passover, the most sacred feast on the Jewish calendar, and the city has gone from its tens of thousands of permanent residents to perhaps 200,000 or more. Jewish pilgrims from all over the Roman Empire have traveled to celebrate the liberation from Egypt. Imagine the streets, imagine the noise, imagine dozens of languages mixing in the markets around the temple. But among all that Babel of tongues, 3 dominate. The first, Aramaic, which is what John calls Hebrew in his Gospel. Aramaic was the language of the people, the language of the street, the market, the home. The scholar Angel Sáenz Badillos, in his History of the Hebrew Language, explains that from the 5th century BC, Aramaic had replaced Hebrew as the everyday language in Palestine during the Persian period. Pure Hebrew was reserved for the synagogue, for reading the Torah, for the rituals of the temple. But the people spoke Aramaic, and here is a detail that is going to hit you. Jesus himself spoke Aramaic. When he cried from the cross, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani," Matthew 27:46, he was speaking Aramaic. When he told the daughter of Jairus, "Talitha kumi," Mark 5:41, he was speaking Aramaic. When he called God Abba in Gethsemane, Mark 14:36, he used the Aramaic word for father, kaizum. The first line of that inscription was in the language Jesus used for his final words. His death sentence was written in his own mother tongue. The second language, Greek. 300 years earlier, Alexander the Great had conquered the Eastern Mediterranean and imposed Greek as the universal language. That is why the entire New Testament was written in Greek. That is why Paul wrote his letters in Greek. Greek was the lingua franca, the language of commerce, of philosophy, of communication between nations. Any educated person in the empire spoke Greek. The third, Latin, the language of power, the language of Rome, of laws, of imperial decrees, of death sentences. In Jerusalem, almost nobody spoke Latin except the soldiers and government officials. But it was the official language. When Rome killed, it announced it in Latin. Pilate wanted everyone to read what he had written. Everyone, without exception. The local Jews who spoke Aramaic, the pilgrims and merchants from the whole world who spoke Greek, and the representatives of imperial power who read Latin. The message was not to escape anyone. But this is only the first layer. Because those 3 languages were not just 3 ways of communicating, they were 3 worlds, 3 civilizations, 3 ways of understanding reality. Latin was the language of power. It was Rome, the empire that controlled the world from Britain to Arabia. When the inscription said in Latin, "Isus Nazarenus Rex Judaeorum," the greatest power humanity had ever known was proclaiming, in its own official language, that Jesus was king. Greek was the language of wisdom. It was Plato, Aristotle, Socrates. It was philosophy, science, culture, reason. When the inscription was read in Greek, all the wisdom of the ancient world was being witness to the fact that true wisdom was found not in the academies of Athens, but hanging from a cross in Jerusalem. Hebrew was the language of revelation. It was Moses on Sinai, the prophets, the Torah, the voice of God speaking directly to his people. When the inscription was read in Hebrew, it was the language of God's eternal covenant that was proclaiming the identity of his Son, power, wisdom, revelation, the three pillars of the ancient world, all three gathered on a single piece of wood, above the head of a dying man, on a mound of rock that looked like a skull. And the reason this matters is that it was not an accident. It was not that Pilate, being an educated man, decided to make a multilingual inscription for elegance. It was because in Jerusalem, during Passover, those three languages literally represented the entire known world. There was no fourth relevant language missing. There was no fifth civilization unrepresented. Latin, Greek, and Hebrew covered everything. Every pilgrim, every merchant, every soldier, every priest who passed before that cross could read at least one of the three lines. Nobody was left out. The cross was literally the center of the world, and the inscription was a universal message before the word universal existed. Coincidence? The Apostle Paul did not think so. Listen to what he wrote in 1 Corinthians 1:22-24. For Jews demand signs, and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. Did you catch that? Jews, Greeks, and the power of God. The same three worlds represented by the three languages of the inscription. For the Jews, Hebrew, the cross was a stumbling block, a scandal, a stone in the road. For the Greeks, Greek, it was folly, an absurd, irrational idea. For Rome, Latin, it was just another execution in a troublesome province. But for God, it was the most powerful moment in human history. And the three languages were proclaiming it without any of those reading understanding what they were proclaiming. If this is opening your eyes to something you have never seen, like this video, because what comes now is going to go much deeper. Because what I just explained about the three languages is already more than most people know in their entire lives. But the third secret is still missing, the one that made the priests lose control, the one hidden in the Hebrew letters. And to see it, I need you to pay close attention. Henri Tissot, an expert in the Hebrew language, consulted with several rabbis to determine what the exact Hebrew translation of the phrase Pilate ordered to be written would be. He recounts this in his book, Eve the Woman, pages 216 to 220. And what he discovered was this. In Hebrew, the phrase, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, is written necessarily as follows, YHWH VMLKH Haifdim, Yeshua Hanotzri Wemelech HaYehudim. And now, take the first letter of each word. In Hebrew, it is read from right to left. The first letter of Yeshua is Yod. The first letter of Hanotzri is He. The first letter of Wemelech is War. The first letter of HaYehudim is He. Yod, He, Wo, He, Yef, YHWH. The Tetragrammaton, the most sacred name in all of the Old Testament. The name God revealed to Moses at the burning bush, I am that I am. Exodus 3:14. The name no Jew could pronounce out loud. The name the high priest only whispered once a year on the Day of Atonement, inside the Holy of Holies of the temple. The name that appears more than 6,800 times in the Old Testament, but was replaced by Adonai every time someone read it, because pronouncing it was considered too sacred, too dangerous. That name, spelled out by the initials of the inscription Pilate ordered to be nailed above the head of Jesus. Think about it. The name God gave himself, the name with which he introduced himself to Moses in the desert, the name by which Israel knew him, the name that represented his eternity, his sovereignty, his presence, was formed, letter by letter, by the initials of the phrase that a pagan Roman governor chose in order to mock the Jews. Pilate did not know Hebrew. He had no idea what he had done. To him, it was just a political provocation, calling a Jew whom Rome was executing king, a way of humiliating the priests who had ruined his mourning. But Pilate's hands wrote what Pilate's mind did not understand. And when the ink dried on that whitened wood, the unpronounceable name of God was spelled out above the head of his son. Now you understand why the priests ran to Pilate. It was not just that the inscription called Jesus King of the Jews. It was that in Hebrew, the initials of that inscription spelled out the unpronounceable name of God, above the head of a crucified man, in full view of all Jerusalem, during Passover, in front of 200,000 pilgrims. For the priests, this was worse than the crucifixion itself. The sacred name of Yahweh, the name they could not even say aloud, displayed publicly above a man they had just declared a blasphemer. If anyone read the inscription in Hebrew and noticed the initials, they were going to think exactly what the priests did not want anyone to think, that the man on that cross was God. I want you to be there. I want you to see it. The priests leave the temple. The Passover preparations are finished. Perhaps they feel relief. The problem of Jesus is resolved. The disciples fled. It is all over. They can celebrate in peace. But then someone arrives agitated, a Levite who passed through the Damascus gate. Come see what Pilate wrote. The priests walk toward Golgotha. They see the 3 crosses. They see Jesus on the middle one. And they lift their eyes to the whitened tablet with red letters hanging above his head. They read the line in Aramaic, and their blood runs cold. Yod, he, war, he. The high priest Caiaphas, who that very morning had torn his robes declaring Jesus a blasphemer, Matthew 26:65, now sees the unpronounceable name of God written above the head of the man he has just condemned, on a public sign, visible to the entire city. They run to Pilate. Change the wording. Don't write King of the Jews. Write that he said he was king. Do you see what they're asking? If Pilate had changed the phrase to, he said, I am King of the Jews, the Hebrew initials would have been completely different. The tetragrammaton would have disappeared. YHWH would have been erased. And with it, the unbearable provocation of seeing the name of God above a crucified man. But Pilate did not change a single letter. What I have written, I have written. And the Bible does not record the priests insisting. There is no second request, no negotiation, no threat. And that is strange, because hours earlier, those same priests had pressed Pilate so hard that they forced him to condemn an innocent man to death. They had political power. They had the threat of Caesar. But over the inscription, they could do nothing. As if an invisible hand had drawn a line that no human power could cross. If you know someone who reads the Bible but has never stopped at this detail, share this video with that person. Because this is something most Christians have never heard. Now I want to be transparent with you, because this channel is always based on the Bible and on verifiable evidence, not on popular traditions or unfounded theories. The connection between the Hebrew initials and the tetragrammaton is an observation that has circulated for centuries, but not all scholars agree. Some point out that the acronym INRI as such is an abbreviation that emerged centuries later in Christian art, and that at the actual moment of the crucifixion, the complete inscription was written in 3 full lines, not as initials. Other scholars question whether the exact Hebrew grammar would necessarily produce those initials. The word Wemelech, with the conjunction W at the beginning, is what produces the letter war. Without that conjunction, the acronym does not work. There are legitimate variations in how the phrase might be translated into Hebrew. But what is an indisputable biblical fact is this: the priests asked for the inscription to be changed. John 19:21 records it clearly. And the question that never goes away is why? Why did they care so much about the wording of a sign above a man they had already succeeded in having condemned to death? Had they not already won? Why keep fighting over a few words? Whether it was because of the Hebrew initials or because of the content itself, that inscription was declaring something they could not accept. Jesus is king. Not he said he was. He is. And there opens one of the most devastating ironies in all the Bible. Think about it. The same priests who had spent their entire lives proclaiming that God was their king, who sang the Psalms about the reign of Yahweh, who expected the Messiah king promised by the prophets, who every morning entered the temple and recited the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Deuteronomy 6:4. Those same men before the cross chose to say the most tragic words ever to come from Jewish lips. We have no king but Caesar. John 19:15. Stop there for a second. You need to feel the weight of that sentence. We have no king but Caesar, said by priests, said by the guardians of Israel's faith, said on the very ground God promised to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. We have no king but Caesar. In that moment, the leaders of Israel renounced everything that made them Israel. They rejected the king who stood before them in order to declare loyalty to the pagan emperor. And then, when a sign above the cross was proclaiming exactly what they should have proclaimed, they ran to ask that it be removed. Those who expected the king had him right in front of them and killed him. Those who sang, "The Lord reigns," chose Caesar. And a Roman pagan who believed in nothing had to write the truth that Israel refused to speak. That is not irony. That is tragedy. And it is a mirror. Because the question that hangs in the air is, who is your king? What Caesar have you placed in the space that belongs to God? But now I want to connect something that is going to change the way you read the story of the crucifixion forever. Because there is a detail about Jesus' own words that fits here like a puzzle piece that had been missing for 2,000 years. The night before he died, Jesus stood before Pilate, and Pilate asked him directly, "Are you the king of the Jews?" John 18:33. Jesus' answer is fascinating. He did not say yes, he did not say no. He said, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" John 18:34. And then he added, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world." John 18:36. Notice, he did not say, "I am not a king." He said, "My kingdom is not from here." It is an affirmation of royalty, not a denial. And Pilate understood it because his next question was, "So, you are a king?" And Jesus replied, "You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth." John 18:37. You say that I am a king. In Greek, this phrase is deliberately ambiguous. It can mean, you say it, not I, or you are speaking the truth. And that ambiguity runs through the entire Passion narrative like an underground river. Because notice something extraordinary. The truth about who Jesus is does not come from the mouths of his followers. It comes from the mouths of his enemies. Pilate writes, "King of the Jews," in 3 languages. The soldiers dress him in a purple robe, which was the color of royalty, place a crown of thorns on his head, put a reed in his hand like a mock scepter, and kneel before him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." John 19:2-3. They are mocking him, but what exactly are they mocking? A man on whom they have placed a king's clothes, a king's crown, a king's scepter, a king's title, and before whom they are kneeling. The mockery is identical to worship, The difference is only in the heart of those performing it. And then those who pass before the cross insult him. If you are the King of Israel, come down from the cross. Matthew 27:42. The priests mock. He saved others. He cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him. Matthew 27:42. Even the criminals crucified at his side insulted him according to Matthew 27:44. Everyone calls him king. Absolutely everyone. Some with an official pen, others with military mockery, others with religious contempt, others with criminal insult. But everyone says it. And the inscription in 3 languages engraves that truth for eternity, as if God had orchestrated the strangest choir in history, a choir of enemies who, without meaning to, were proclaiming the truth they could not see. And there is a statement of Jesus that connects this to the 3 languages in a way perhaps nobody has ever explained to you. In John 12:32, Jesus said, "And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself." And John clarifies, he said this to show by what kind of death he was going to die. Lifted up from the earth, I will draw all, not only the Jews, not only the Greeks, not only the Romans, all. And when he was lifted up on the cross, the inscription above his head declared his identity in the 3 languages that represented all. Hebrew for Israel, Greek for the nations, Latin for the empire. The prophecy was fulfilled literally in the inscription. 3 languages, 3 worlds, all called to read who the man was who was dying for them. Now, I want you to see something that most people miss entirely. Something that connects the meaning of INRI with the 3 languages and with the power of the cross in a way that will leave you thinking for days. Think about the 3 people who had the most power over the life of Jesus at that moment. Pilate had the political power to condemn or release him. He represented Rome. He represented Latin. He represented the most powerful empire in the world. He condemned him, but he also wrote the inscription that proclaimed him king. The political power signed the death sentence and at the same time signed the coronation declaration. The priests had the religious power to declare who was holy and who was a blasphemer. They represented the faith of Israel. They represented Hebrew. They represented the revelation of God. They declared Jesus a blasphemer, but by asking for the inscription to be changed, they admitted that those words had a power that terrified them. The religious power rejected the Messiah and, at the same time, confirmed that his words were dangerously true. And Jesus himself had the power to come down from the cross at any moment. Matthew 26:53. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? 12 legions. More than 72,000 angels. The power to destroy Golgotha, Jerusalem, Rome, and the entire empire with a single word. And he chose not to use it. He chose to stay. He chose to die beneath a sign that declared him king in 3 languages. The divine power could have destroyed the cross, but chose to redeem the world from it. The one who had political power proclaimed him king without believing it. Those who had religious power tried to silence that proclamation and failed. And the one who had all the power in the universe chose not to use it because his kingdom was established not with armies, but with a cross. Latin, Hebrew, and Greek. Power, revelation, and wisdom. Pilate, the priests, and Jesus. 3 languages, 3 powers, 3 different responses to the same man nailed to a beam, and all 3, without knowing it, were proclaiming the same truth. In Colossians 2:15, Paul described exactly what was happening in that moment. Christ disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him. Put them to open shame on the cross, triumphing. Exactly what the inscription did, displaying publicly in 3 languages who the man really was that Rome believed it was executing. The titulus was the sentence of a criminal, but read with the eyes of faith, it was the banner of a king. If this is touching something inside you, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because every week we unearth hidden layers of the scriptures that can transform the way you see God. Now, before showing you the final connection, I want you to think about something. If you have ever felt that God is not in control, that circumstances are overwhelming you, that chaos won, that evil triumphed, look at that inscription. Look at what happened at Golgotha. 3 linguistic empires of the ancient world, 3 sources of human power, all involuntarily brought to their knees before a man dying naked between 2 criminals. The power of Rome wrote the truth without knowing it. The wisdom of Greece read it without understanding it, and the faith of Israel saw it without accepting it. But the truth was there, in 3 languages, written with letters that blood could not erase. If you feel that everything around your life is trying to silence the work of God, think about that inscription. The most powerful priests of Israel could not change a single letter. The governor of Rome, who had the power to kill and to pardon, became the involuntary instrument of divine truth. And Jesus, who could have come down from the cross at any moment, chose to stay, because he knew something that nobody else knew, that victory is not won by coming down from the cross, it is won by staying on it. And those 4 letters, INRI, declared it to the world. In the 3 languages the world knew. Now I want to take you to the final connection, the deepest of all. But first, there is something that confuses many people and that we need to address. Because if you read the 4 Gospels carefully, you will notice that each one records the inscription differently. Matthew 27:37 says, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." Mark 15:26 says, "The King of the Jews." Luke 23:38 says, "This is the King of the Jews." John 19:19 says, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." 4 different versions. Critics of the Bible have pointed to these differences for centuries as supposed evidence of error. But when you understand that the inscription was in 3 languages, the supposed contradiction vanishes. Think of it this way. If a detective interviews 4 witnesses of an accident and all 4 give slightly different versions, the detective does not conclude that the accident did not happen. He concludes he has 4 independent perspectives on the same event. And in fact, if all 4 said exactly the same thing, word for word, the detective would suspect they had coordinated their stories beforehand. Minor differences are evidence of independence, not of falsehood. The same applies here. Each language has its own grammar. Latin does not translate the same way as Greek. Greek does not translate the same way as Aramaic. The 3 lines of the inscription said the same thing, but with slight grammatical variations particular to each language. And each evangelist cited the version most relevant to his audience. John, who is the only one who mentions Pilate by name and who calls the inscription a title, the Latin word titulus, is probably citing the Latin version, the official version. Mark, who tends to be direct, cites the 3 words common to all 3 languages, the King of the Jews, and Matthew and Luke cite the Greek and Hebrew versions respectively, each with its own grammatical nuances. The differences between the 4 Gospels do not weaken the account. They strengthen it. They show that the 4 writers did not copy from one another. Each one saw the inscription or received the testimony of direct eyewitnesses. And the variations are exactly what an honest investigator would expect to find. And now I want to take you to Rome, to a basilica with a strange name, Santa Croce in Gerusalemme, the Holy Cross in Jerusalem. A church in Rome called In Jerusalem? The story is fascinating. Around the year 325, Empress Helena, mother of Emperor Constantine, traveled to the Holy Land and brought back relics of the Crucifixion, fragments of the cross, nails, and supposedly a part of the original inscription, the titulus crucis. The church was built over her palace, and according to tradition, the floor was covered with soil from Jerusalem. The pilgrimageria who visited Jerusalem around the year 383 wrote that she saw the titulus displayed during Holy Week ceremonies. But afterward, for centuries, the relic disappeared until February 1st, 1492. While Christopher Columbus was preparing the voyage that would change history, in that same basilica in Rome, workers broke an old brick during a restoration. Behind it, they found a lead box sealed with the seal of a 12th century cardinal. And inside that box, a piece of walnut wood with an inscription in 3 languages: Hebrew, Greek, Latin. In 1997, German historian Michael Hessemann presented the inscription to 7 paleography experts from Israeli universities: Gabriel Barkay, Hanan Eshel, Esther Eshel, Leah de Segni, Israel Roll, Benjamin Isaac, and Carsten Peter Tiede. What they found divided the academic world. Not one of the 7 found signs of medieval forgery in the writing style. The majority dated the strokes between the 1st and 3rd or 4th century, with the majority favoring the 1st century. Tiede went further. He suggested the writing was probably done by a Jewish scribe, not a medieval European copyist. The shapes of the letters, the ligatures, the spaces between words, all pointed to an ancient hand, not a modern one. That was in 1997. The academic world was expectant. Could it be that the real inscription from the cross of Jesus had survived 2,000 years? But in 2002, the University of Roma Tre carried out carbon-14 tests, and the result fell like a bucket of cold water. The wood dated from between the years 980 and 1146. Medieval times, 1,000 years after Jesus. Original or copy? Scholar Maria Luisa Rigato from the Pontifical Gregorian University proposed that it is a faithful reproduction of the original, created to preserve the content as the original deteriorated. Others, such as Stephen Fan from the University of the Holy Land, are not convinced. But, and this is what matters, whether that piece of wood in Rome is authentic, a copy, or a forgery, it changes absolutely nothing of what the Bible says. John 19:22 does not depend on any relic in an Italian basilica. It depends on the Word of God, and the Word says Pilate wrote a title. He put it on the cross. It was in 3 languages. The priests tried to change it, and they failed. What the history of that relic does demonstrate is something powerful. For 2,000 years, humanity has not been able to stop looking at those 4 letters. INRI. We have carved them, painted them, embroidered them, engraved them in stone, in wood, in gold. Something about that inscription draws us like a magnet. It is not the wood. It is not the letters. It is what they mean. And now, yes, the connection that ties everything together. Because there is an arc that connects 3 moments in biblical history, separated by thousands of years, through a single thread. Languages. Genesis 11. The Tower of Babel. All of humanity speaks a single language. And in their arrogance, they decide, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves." Genesis 11:4. Let us make a name for ourselves. Notice that. They wanted to make a name for themselves. They wanted to build something so high, so impressive, that their name would be remembered forever. And God confused their languages. One people fragmented into nations. The words that once united became walls that separated. And for thousands of years, languages were barriers between peoples. The Rabbi Jonathan Sacks wrote that Babel was not punished for building a tower, but for wanting a uniformity that would eliminate diversity. God did not create humanity to speak a single language and think a single thought. The diversity of tongues is not a punishment. It is a design. But the separation that came with the diversity, the inability to understand one another, to communicate the truth from one people to another, that was an open wound in human history, and at Golgotha, 3 of those fragmented tongues were gathered in a single place, on a single piece of wood, proclaiming a single name. Not the name men wanted to make for themselves, but the name God placed above his Son. Babel said, "Let us make ourselves a name." The cross said, "This is his name." Human arrogance wanted to rise toward God by building a tower. Divine grace descended toward men hanging from a beam. Babel was humanity saying, "We will reach you." The cross was God saying, "I come down to you." Think about what that means for you today. We live in a world as fragmented as Babel, languages that separate, cultures that clash. Screens that connect us but isolate us in bubbles where we only hear what we already believe. A digital Babel where everyone speaks and nobody understands each other. And yet, 4 letters keep uniting. INRI. A farmer in Guatemala and a professor in Tokyo and a grandmother in Nigeria recognize them equally, not because they speak the same language, but because they point to the same king. Psalm 2 prophesied it 3,000 years ago. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed. Psalm 2:1-2. And God's response, "As for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill." Psalm 2:6. I have set my king. Men conspire, empires rise, languages divide. But God places his king, and the inscription in 3 languages was the first public proclamation of that truth. And it does not end at the cross. 50 days after the crucifixion, Pentecost, Jerusalem full of pilgrims again, this time for the Feast of Weeks. The Holy Spirit descends on the disciples. Acts 2:4, they began to speak in other tongues. Acts 2:6, each one was hearing them speak in his own language. And Luke takes the trouble to make a geographical list that covers practically the entire known world. Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, Libya, Rome, Crete, Arabia, 15 regions, dozens of languages. All the languages of the ancient world hearing the mighty works of God. And where did this happen? In Jerusalem, less than a kilometer from Golgotha. 50 days earlier, within that same geographic radius, 3 languages had proclaimed Jesus, King of the Jews, above a cross. And now, in the same place, the Holy Spirit multiplies those 3 languages into 15, into 20, into all that were present, as if the trilingual inscription on the cross had been the seed and Pentecost was the harvest. 3 languages planted in a beam. All languages blossoming in an upper room. The reaction of the crowd was, "What does this mean?" Acts 2:12, the same question we ask when we see INRI on a cross. What does this mean? What do those 4 letters mean? Why were they put in 3 languages? What was really happening on that piece of wood above the head of a dying man? And Peter stood up and gave the answer, the definitive answer. Acts 2:36. Let all the house of Israel therefore know for certain that God has made him both Lord and Christ, this Jesus whom you crucified. Crucified, Lord, Christ. The man on the cross with the INRI sign is the Lord of the universe. That is what it means. That is what those 4 letters mean that grandmother has on her rosary. That is what is written above the door of millions of homes without anyone stopping to ask what it means. Babel scattered the languages through sin. The cross gathered 3 languages to proclaim the Savior, and Pentecost freed all languages to proclaim salvation. 3 acts, 1 divine drama. The trilingual inscription of the cross was the bridge between Babel and Pentecost, the hinge of the history of salvation. Why did God choose that the most important moment in human history be proclaimed in 3 languages? Because salvation was not only for the Jews, Hebrew, it was not only for the educated, Greek, it was not only for the powerful, Latin, it was for all. Revelation 5:9 says that Christ was slain, and with his blood redeemed people from every tribe and language and people and nation. Tribe, language, people, nation. The inscription on the cross was the first public proclamation of that universal truth. 3 languages, the entire world represented. I want to close with something I cannot get out of my head. There is a prophecy that seals everything we have discovered today. Zechariah 14:9, and the Lord will be king over all the earth. On that day the Lord will be one and his name one. One God, one name, over all the earth, over all languages, and on the cross of Calvary, for the first time in history, the name of God was proclaimed as King before representatives of all the known earth. Hebrew, the covenant people. Greek, the world of the nations. Latin, the empire that governed from Britain to Arabia. All the earth. One name, Jesus, King. Zechariah prophesied it. The cross fulfilled it. Pentecost expanded it. Do you remember that at the beginning of the video I told you about the workers who in 1492 found the relic of the titulus crucis in Rome? The same year Columbus was discovering America, lands that had never heard the name of Jesus. The same year the world was getting larger, someone found the smallest and most powerful sign ever written, as if Providence was saying, "The world grows, and my name reaches every corner." Today, 2,000 years later, INRI is still written on crosses all over the world. In cathedrals in Europe, in chapels in Latin America, in underground churches in China, in homes in Africa, in hospitals in Asia. 4 Latin letters that no longer need translation. Now imagine a woman in a hospital. It is 3 in the morning. She is sitting beside her mother's bed, who sleeps connected to machines. She cannot sleep. She is afraid. On the bedside table is an old, worn rosary with a small crucifix that has 4 letters engraved on it, INRI. She picks it up. She squeezes it between her fingers, and for the first time in her life, she asks, "What do these letters mean?" They mean that Jesus is King, that they were written in 3 languages so the whole world would know, that the powerful tried to erase them and could not, that the name of God was hidden in those letters, and that what God writes no one can erase, not illness, not fear, not 3 in the morning in a hospital. There are millions of people who walk past those 4 letters every day without asking themselves what they mean. The grandmother who has had a crucifix above her door for 40 years. The young person who sees INRI on their mother's rosary and thinks it is decoration. The believer who wears a cross around their neck without knowing that those letters tell a story of power, of wisdom, of divine revelation, of a governor who proclaimed the truth without knowing it, of priests who tried to silence it and failed, and of a God who chose to die beneath his own name. But now you know. Now you know what they mean. You know why they are in 3 languages. You know what they hide in Hebrew. You know why the priests panicked. You know what Pilate wrote without understanding, and you know that those 4 letters are far more than an ancient inscription. They are proof that God does not lose control, even when his Son is dying on a cross. They are a reminder that the King remains King even when he appears to be defeated. They are the briefest, most powerful, and most indestructible declaration ever written on a piece of wood. What God has written about your life, no one can change. Not circumstances, not the enemy, not your own past. What God has written about you is written in letters that no human hand can erase. Proverbs 21:1. The king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he will. The heart of Pilate was in the hand of God. And God wrote exactly what he wanted to write, in the exact languages he wanted to use, with the exact words he wanted to pronounce. And when the priests tried to erase what God had set in motion, the answer was the same as it has always been: you cannot. What I have written, I have written. What God declares stands declared. What the cross proclaims, no power on earth can silence. 3 languages, 3 worlds, 3 secrets, 1 single truth. As Pilate said, without knowing, he was speaking through the mouth of God. What I have written, I have written. I have. What follows is going to challenge something you perhaps have never questioned about the Bible, and it may change the way you read every page. Click on the video appearing on screen now.